Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Overtime, What Every Employer Needs to Know Today. Compliance is like personal hygiene. It's something that should be planned into your routine. You don't brush your teeth and floss only before you go to the dentist, right? Compliance processes should be part of your organization's culture and DNA, not an afterthought when new rules arise. We frequently joke that January's handbook season due to the vast amount of January 1st updates. So you just make annual updates, or do you have a quarterly plan? Keep your handbook up to date all year. If you're a ComplianceHR subscriber, you get policy updates in your bi-monthly Policy Smart newsletters, so you're always up to date and compliant. I've never heard anyone say it was overtime classification season, but when new rules are looming, all organizations start thinking about audits. Many of you may remember the proposed changes in 2016. I will tell you, that was definitely overtime classification season. People were scrambling to meet the year-end deadlines. Things have been quiet for the past few years, but new regulation is on the horizon, and our presentation today will help you prepare. I'm Michael Worth. I'm the Vice President of Compliance HR, and I've been with the organization since it started 8 years ago. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. We acknowledge it's not always easy to break away for an hour on your busy day, and we greatly appreciate your time. We have a great session lined up with my friend David Jordan, who's a Littler shareholder and a thought leader on overtime regulation. For those of you who are unfamiliar with ComplianceHR, we're a unique combination of an artificial intelligence platform called Neota and Littler Mendelsohn, the world's largest employment law firm. There's no guessing or Googling when you need accurate and up-to-date information. You get it right every time. Our goal is to simplify employment law. And to achieve our goal, we offer a suite of technology solutions around critical HR compliance tools. We have tools for independent contractor classification. I mentioned Policy Smart, our handbook tool. We have tools that help you with onboarding and leave. But today, I'm going to focus on Navigator OT, Navigator Overtime. This is my favorite solution. It applies all federal and state rules, and Littler has analyzed thousands of cases and opinion letters, and that logic is built into our reasoning engine. It's kind of neat because it kind of thinks like a person. Based on this fact pattern and this jurisdiction, here's your level of risk. So we start by going and figuring out what state does the individual work in and what are the compensation details. Depending on what state you pick, we'll go down a different decision tree and apply the rules that are for that jurisdiction. Then we would go and identify what exemptions am I looking for. If I'm going for the learned professional and I put in that this individual has a master's, that will fire off a series of questions regarding the learned professional exemption. All right, so next is the job duties, and this is where Littler did all the heavy lifting. There's 3 pages of job duties, and the goal is to identify the top 3 to 5 things the individual does on a daily or weekly basis. Not only are these arranged by topic, but they can be expanded for descriptions, definitions, and examples of how they play out in the workplace. So you can drill down and get great information about all of this. And just like in a traditional audit, we'll need to go in, allocate time, importance, and a level of authority. And once I've put in my entire fact pattern and hit submit, the system comes back, whoops, going the wrong way here, try this way. It comes back and it gives you immediate guidance right on the fly. It tells you the level of the risk with the risk meter. But more importantly, it helps you understand your risk. It starts by citing the law that an executive needs to supervise 80 hours of work by other people. And then it looks at your fact pattern and tells you why there's potential risk. So anywhere it finds potential risk, it states the law and then it compares it to your fact pattern. We also provide you with a transcript of how everything was answered and a summary of the federal and state rules. All of this information sits in the dashboard. It can be filtered and sorted by any of the data elements in here. Some folks look at the ones that come back green and say, hey, those are fine, let's push them to the left. The ones that come back right, we're probably never going to get those right, so let's just leave them alone. The ones in the middle is where you can bring Littler in to help you understand, should I push it to the left or right? And once you've gone back and looked at this, you can open up that risk report, determine what you want to do, and you don't need to rerun it. I can simply copy it. It'll bring up a new evaluation, and I can make the changes needed. Also, if the rules change after you've run many of these evaluations, you can come back and hit copy and rerun them, and they will automatically apply the new rules. This is why people hate doing traditional audits. It's long, hard work, and it's hard to get it right. With our system, you can use our tools to help you understand where your riskiest positions are and get to work. Okay, if you're interested in learning more about this, take a survey right now on the screen. If you're in full screen mode, please turn it off. You need to get out of full screen mode if you'd like to see the poll. If you answer yes to this, we will contact you to coordinate a meeting. We'll sit down with you, discuss your requirements, and we'll review the Navigator Suite functionality with you. And during your 1-week free trial, you'll see classification audits no longer have to be a dreaded task. You can quickly identify your most challenging positions and focus your time and money reducing your biggest liabilities. So you can go ahead and we'll keep that survey up for a few more minutes. You can also ask for any information regarding us or any questions you have in the Q&A box. And please, don't hesitate to put questions in here. We'd love to hear what you think. And yes, at the end of our presentation, we will send a recording out to everyone from ComplianceHR, and it will also be available in the Beacon Live webinar account. All right, I'll give you a few more seconds here to finish up the survey for those of you who want. If you didn't sign up now, we'll also put this up in the end, and so you'll have another opportunity to sign up for a free trial with us then. Okay, now to the good stuff. I have the pleasure of introducing you to David Jordan. David is a shareholder in Littler's Houston office. He provides wage and hour advice and defends employers in complex and class action wage and hour lawsuits across the country. Prior to practicing law 20 years ago, David was a business owner himself, and he was frequently frustrated with the difficulties in managing the complex and often irreconcilable wage and hour laws that all of you likely struggle with today. David, welcome, and I'll pass it over to you.
Hey, well, thanks a lot, Michael, and it's great to talk to all these wonderful people today about overtime. You know, what a fascinating issue that we all have to deal with here. It's math, it's numbers, it's technical, it's difficult, it's not easy, and hopefully we can walk through some of these issues today, a little bit about the past, a little bit about what the law is, and then sort of today's spin on what's going on with overtime today. So I want to start with an example that has nothing to do with overtime. I thought this was a nice illustration to get the point across. Here is a sample framework of risk from a discrimination lawsuit. Everybody on this call has probably dealt with discrimination lawsuits. Usually involves one employee, there's back wages at issue, there's front pay at issue, there can be punitive damages under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, the federal law. Those damages can be capped for some employers at $300,000. Cases settle somewhere between $5,000 and $25,000, at least down here in Texas. I know in other parts of the country you might have to add a few numbers to that, but that's a general range for settling a single plaintiff discrimination lawsuit. Usually impacts a few supervisors, a few employees, a few HR personnel. The burden's on the employee to prove it. There's usually a few depositions. A trial takes 2 or 3 days. That's the framework of a discrimination lawsuit. Now, I want you to think about that exposure, sort of the low 6-figure exposure, and think about how much time your organization and your HR departments and your managers have devoted to training and teaching employees and supervisors about how to operate in a harassment-free workplace, how to avoid discrimination and improve equity in the workplace, how to improve diversity initiatives, all to reduce the likelihood of these types of lawsuits. You probably spend hundreds of hours a year focusing on harassment and discrimination issues. And this is the exposure. what I typically find is that employers devote a fraction of that kind of time to wage and hour disputes. And this is a framework of a typical FLSA lawsuit. Let's say we have hundreds or thousands of employees subject to a particular pay practice, maybe not including overtime properly or calculating overtime properly. Under federal law, we're not talking about state law, under federal law, it's a 3-year look back. You double it for liquidated damages. You only need one employee, just one, to start a collective or class action litigation that covers the whole country from Puerto Rico to Alaska. Full exposure in these cases can be 7, 8, even 9 figures. I had a case where the exposure was $500 million because workers weren't properly classified as exempt. Those cases typically settle 6, 7, 8 figures. There's automatic attorney's fees, and the burdens are on the employer, not the employee. And employers spend a fraction of the amount of time working on FLSA and other wage and hour related issues than they do on discrimination and harassment issues. I'm not saying discrimination and harassment and diversity issues aren't of critical importance in the workplace today. They are. But I think as HR leaders and labor and employment attorneys, we've gotten really good at managing those issues. And we've got to brush up on our skills as it relates to wage and hour exposure. What are the most prevalent types of wage and hour liability? I've sort of identified from the most prevalent to least prevalent. The most prevalent and the most exposure is not paying overtime. And that's why we're here today, to talk about overtime. And there's different ways we can screw that up as employers. We can misclassify somebody as exempt from overtime, and you've heard Michael talk about the Navigator OT model, something I've been involved with since its inception years ago. Those cases that are analyzed in the Navigator OT program at ComplianceHR, I was part of that framework, helping design a tool that you could use. But misclassifying as exempt, then there's the direction to not pay overtime at all. And then there's the miscalculation of overtime. So we're going to talk about that as well today. Other types of wage and hour claims: not paying minimum wage. We still see that. Not paying all hours worked. You hear what we might call off-the-clock cases. Somebody doesn't get paid for their preliminary hours before work or for their hours at the end of the shift. But the key is the overtime. Federal law looks back 3 years. But I don't want you to forget about state laws. And we're going to talk more about state laws through this entire presentation. But you'll see on this chart, there are multiple states where certain wage and hour claims can have a limitations period longer than 3 years ago. There's at least one state that claims they don't have a limitations period at all. Like, doesn't exist. And we would take defense of that. But between federal law going back 3 years and some states stretching back 4, 5, 6, 7 years, there's a lot at risk here with regards to how we handle overtime. Let's start with exemptions. It's really the chief issue, I think, that we see, the biggest errors. That's really, I think, in my opinion, what the Navigator OT product does the best. That's where your labor and employment lawyers, like at Littler Mendelson, can help you navigate. These are the chief exemptions. Now, there's others that aren't on here, like if you work at a Christmas tree farm, there's an exemption there too. In here we've got the executive, administrative, and professional exemptions, what we call the white-collar exemptions. We've got the highly compensated exemption. Some people call that an exception and not an exemption. We've got the computer exemption. We've got an outside sales exemption, not inside sales, outside sales. We've got a Motor Carrier Act exemption. I just tried a big class action on the Motor Carrier Act exemption a few months ago. We have a retail sales, what they call 7I exemption for employees that sell retail sales or services and earn commissions. And in all of those, the burden of proof to prove those is on the employer. That is, unless you can prove an exemption applies, the employee is going to prevail if they did not receive overtime. The other thing I want to remind you of is there's lots of states that have variations on all of these exemptions. Some states don't have the Motor Carrier Act exemption. Some states don't recognize the retail sales exemption. Some states don't recognize the outside sales exemption. Some don't recognize the highly compensated exception. The highly compensated exception, as you may know, is if you reach a certain high level of compensation, you only have to meet one of the job duties under the executive, administrative, and professional exemption. We'll talk about that in just a second. But you'll see a chart here where if you have somebody that's highly compensated in Texas, it could be exempt there. But if they happen to work in Maryland, they're no longer exempt. Now, this isn't exactly a new issue, but let me tell you where it's attacking everyone today. I have so many clients that are telling me they have remote workers everywhere. I have so many clients telling me they have remote workers everywhere and they have no idea where they are. They have not even figured out how to get the information. They feel like they've asked their employees to tell them, where are you? And they were getting back fraudulent information from their employees. Their employees don't want to tell them that they're in Guam or California or Europe or Louisiana. The result is that companies, let's say a nice, quiet, Alabama-based company, now has workers scattered across the country, and it used to be enough to know what the laws of Alabama were. But now, if you have somebody that happens to be sitting out on the beach in California, reading invoices all day as a remote worker, California law now applies, because that's where they're doing the work. And so it is critical now that as you think about your exemptions, and we're going to talk about this through the whole day, that you know where your workforce is. And if you have not figured that out yet, I would encourage you to make that your Q2 project. Before this quarter ends, you're going to know where every one of your workers are located, and you're going to have a mechanism for identifying where those workers are periodically or over time, accurately, so that when you make assessments as to whether you're properly paying people or properly providing any other benefits or leaves or breaks or anything else that comes up under the employment laws, you'll be applying the proper law. So what's the general test for exemptions? There's really three tests. There's the compensation. There's two subparts of the compensation test: the minimum level of compensation, what we call the salary level. And there's the type of compensation, the salary basis. And then there's the duties test. What kind of duties do they have, and do they fit within one of those enumerated exemptions I outlined? Let me talk for a minute about, let me back up. Let me talk for a minute about the compensation test. The current salary level under the law is $684 a week, which is approximately $35,000 a year, a little over $35,000. If you recall, it used to be $23,000 a year. You may recall that President Obama proposed moving it to $47,000 back in 2016. Everybody got ready for a rollout at the end of 2016. And on Thanksgiving weekend, a judge in Texas decided that he was going to enjoin the White House from enforcing those regulations. And so we immediately went back to $23,000, and the Trump administration was able to move those salary levels again, but only to $684 a week in September of 2019. Okay, that's the background. That's why we're at $684. Here's where we're at today. We sort of have two dueling interests. The Department of Labor has continued to say on their regulatory agenda that they are going to have a notice of proposed rulemaking moving the salary level by May of 2023. Now it is April of 2023. I suspect by May of 2023, we'll either have a new deadline or we'll have an NPRM from the Department of Labor. Now what we would get is a notice with a new number, a comment period, where people all over the country would write letters. Lots of employees and unions will write letters. Employers should write letters too. Not just trade associations, not just law firms, but good old-fashioned employers. There are about 2,100 people on this call right now. That could be 2,100 letters to the Department of Labor saying, this is why this salary level is too high. And you can work with Littler Mendelson to help you on that. We have a lobbying group called the Workplace Policy Institute. If you're not aware of that organization, that will be very involved. But it requires the employers get involved if they want to push back on those numbers. Because I guarantee you the unions will be out there motivating their base to write letters to the Department of Labor in support of raising that number. The number could be as high as $75,000, $80,000, $85,000 a year. It's nearly double where we're at right now. Right now in Congress, we've got the Restoring Overtime Pay Act of 2023 by Senator Brown of Ohio. He's proposing pushing the salary level test to $45,000 immediately, and by January of 26, we'll be at $82,000 a year just to meet the salary level for the exemptions. Okay, so for the rest of the day, I just want you to think about 75 to 85, that's the new range. It's going to come up later on at the end of the call when I kind of talk about sort of what do we do about this. But that's essentially where we're going to eventually go on the salary level. That's, I think, the big news for all of you. So stay tuned and pay attention. Pay attention to Littler.com. Pay attention to your other trade associations where you get this information to figure out what's happening, and listen for those opportunities to write comments. A couple of notes about the salary level test. There are some exceptions. There's no compensation requirements for doctors, lawyers, and teachers. Boo me. Also for outside sales workers. Computer employees can be exempt and be paid on an hourly basis of at least $27.63 if you meet the duties portion of the computer exception. So that's a weird issue. Commissioned employees of retail establishments, notice I mentioned that 7I exception. There's no salary level there required. And there's this note about for certain professional and administrative employees, you can pay on a fee basis. if you want to reach out to me at some point, I can give you some more color on what that means. It's not often used, but there are exceptions to the minimum salary rule. There's also states where we have a higher salary level than the FLSA, and I've highlighted those here. So we've talked about the 684 under federal law. These states have even higher levels. So imagine you're in Alabama and you have an employee that's in New York working remotely in upstate New York. You may have to recheck whether that worker remains exempt or whether you need to raise the salary to get that employee to the proper level. So let me now talk a little bit about the salary basis test. The salary basis test basically says that you have to pay employees a guaranteed salary each work week that is not subject to deduction for quality or quantity of work. And there's been, I think, quite a lot of developments with regards to this particular issue. And I don't want to get too much in the weeds, but there's a lot of interesting things that came out of a particular case this spring. And that was one that was pending in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. It's called Hewitt versus Helix. Helix was an oil and gas company. And in that case, they paid the worker a day rate. And that day rate was over $1,000 a day. And what Helix said is, because we guarantee that worker at least one day a week, and that one day a week is over $684, we therefore meet the salary basis test. And the Supreme Court said, nope. Paying someone a salary means to pay someone a regular amount each week rather than a daily or hourly rate. Now, that sounds really obvious. That was the Supreme Court's point. Come on, weekly doesn't mean daily. I think the questions always had been, does salary basis, does a salary mean weekly? Or can it mean something else? The Supreme Court, I think, has settled this issue that a salary means weekly. The other interesting thing that came out of the Hewitt versus Helix case is something that's a little bit more in the weeds. A lot of employers will pay exempt workers extra compensation when they go over a certain number of hours a week. Let's say you hit 50 hours a week, and if we need you to work on the weekend, we'll pay you $50 an hour for every hour you work on the weekend. That is permissible under federal law. And there's always been a rule in the regulations that says, however, the total compensation this employee receives when you add up their guaranteed salary and all this extra hourly pay, there has to be a reasonable relationship between that big number and their guaranteed salary. A few years ago, there was an opinion letter from the Department of Labor that said that ratio is 1.5 times, which means the total compensation cannot be more than 150% of the guaranteed salary. So you can't have a little tiny salary and lots of hourly wages. Well, the Hewitt versus Helix Supreme Court said that applies even under the highly compensated exception. So remember, we talked about the highly compensated exception. If you're paid over $107,000 a year, you only meet one of the duties of the white-collar exemptions. You can remain exempt. The argument that a lot of employers made, and there were certain courts that agreed, was that you don't have to meet the reasonable relationship test because your compensation number is just so darn high. Supreme Court said, nope, that's not how the regulations are written. The reasonable relationship test applies to everyone who has compensation calculated on an hourly, daily, or fee basis, along with the guaranteed salary. So if you happen to be one of these employers that sort of pays that additional compensation on top of the guaranteed salary, it doesn't matter if you have workers over the 107 mark or not. And the employee side lawyers are really juiced about this issue. So they're out looking for cases on this point. This is the sort of thing that a good pay audit would help discover for you. This issue of 150%, the reasonable relationship test that can be measured sort of over time, it's not something you can just look at a paycheck and figure out, so it does take a little bit of work. But I think the most interesting thing to come out of the Hewitt versus Helix case, now remember, this is the first FLSA case considered by this new Republican-dominated Supreme Court. Even though the employers lost in that case, Justice Kavanaugh said something really interesting. Now, before I tell you what he said, I want to take you back to 2016. You remember I told you they struck down the President Obama regulations on the salary basis, on the salary level. In that opinion, the judge from the Northern District of Texas said, gosh, the whole salary level issue isn't even in the statutory text of the Fair Labor Standards Act. Where does the Department of Labor come up with that anyway? There's no basis for salary level. Well, fast forward a few years, we hear another judge on the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals make the same comment in oral argument. Then during the Hewitt versus Helix briefing, the state of Mississippi and the state of Utah and some other states brought it up again. And Brett Kavanaugh, in his dissent in Hewitt versus Helix, said this, and I'm going to tell you why this is important in a minute. But he said, the Act focuses, this is the FLSA focuses on whether the employee performs executive duties, not how much an employee is paid or how an employee is paid, right? Salary level and salary basis. So it is questionable whether the department's regulations, whether the DOL, which look not only at an employee's duties, but also at how much an employee is paid and how an employee is paid, will survive if and when the regulations are challenged as inconsistent with the Act. Now that is remarkable because the Supreme Court basically said the Department of Labor is wrong. And that is a big deal. And we expect employers to challenge in the right courts with the right judges the whole framework of the Department of Labor's overtime regulations, potentially just trying to blow them up. If you think about the things you see courts doing today, think about what you saw in federal court a few weeks ago in Texas with outlawing the FDA's new abortion bill, for example. Courts are doing wild things. It is not out of the realm of possibility. A judge may come along and say, we agree with Justice Kavanaugh, these regulations should go away. And in fact, right now in Texas, in the Western District of Texas, a restaurant owner sued the Department of Labor on this exact point, and it's currently being briefed for summary judgment. So we may start to hear from courts on this very issue. Now this is very starry-eyed stuff, but we've heard it now from multiple judges in court, including Justice Brett Kavanaugh in the Supreme Court. Let me talk about deductions for exempt salary workers. Remember I told you can't make deductions for quality or quantity of work. There's only a few ways you can make deductions. You can make full day deductions for personal reasons, for bona fide sick leave policies. You can make smaller incremental deductions if you have a qualifying FMLA leave. You can make deductions for jury, witness, or military pay just as an offset. You can do penalties for violations of major safety violations, very uncommon. You can have unpaid disciplinary suspensions of 1 or more full days. And you can pay less than the full salary in the first and last week of someone's employment. You cannot deduct, we believe, from an exempt worker for things like lost equipment, or ruined uniforms, or a retention bonus that you have to recover. There are some real risks in making those sorts of deductions from exempt workers. Now, a lot of employers will say, we'll take the risk, but we need to get our money back. But keep in mind, those are likely problematic. And an employee lawyer who sees that may very well point that out. So I'm going to try to get through some exemptions real quick. I just want to talk briefly about the exemptions just to remind you guys of a few key points. They're all based on the primary duty of the worker. That means the principal, main, major, or most important duty that employee performs. It is usually somebody who spends more than 50% of their time performing exempt work, but does not have to be. The regulations do not require that exempt employees spend more than 50% of their time performing work. But some states do. And I've highlighted those here. The exempt work has to be 80% of the job, at least, because the non-exempt work can only be 20%. And this 50% issue, of course, that's a qualitative analysis under federal law, but some other states quantify it. So there's actually a 50% rule, like numerically in California, for example. So keep that in mind. Real quickly on the executive duties for an executive exemption: primary duty of management, customarily and regularly direct the work of 2 or more full-time employees, and the authority to hire or fire. Those are the 3 key elements for an executive exemption. For an administrative exemption, the primary duty is the performance of office or non-manual work directly related to the management or general business operations of the employer. I tend to think about, do you make the widgets or do you do something else? You make the widgets, you don't fall in this exemption. You do other stuff, you may fall into it. But the most important element here is the exercise of discretion and independent judgment with respect to matters of significance. By the way, when I think about the things that ComplianceHR does well, this Navigator OT system, it is a great tool for helping you flesh out that issue. And I think this is one of the hardest issues for lawyers, for HR departments, for courts, for the Department of Labor to figure out, is that exercise of discretion and independent judgment with respect to matters of significance. So what Navigator OT has done is pack so much information into its tool about what the rules are that it can really help give you a dynamic answer, a dynamic risk profile about whether the particular person or job you're looking at fits that profile or not. It is a very difficult issue. And I frequently talk to employers who ask me to help on this issue, and I'll tell you 9 out of 10 times the worker does not have the exercise of discretion and independent judgment that's needed to meet that test. The learned professional exemption, you have to have a degree. Your duty has to include the performance of work that requires a degree in advanced knowledge in the field of science or learning. And it's typically a prolonged course of specialized intellectual instruction. See a lot of employers out there that have degree requirements that don't fit the job. So it's not enough to say you got to have a master's in engineering. You got to use the master of engineering, right? The first test is the duty must be the performance of work requiring the advanced knowledge. And again, Navigator OT is helpful on that piece. There's a sort of often forgotten creative professional exemption. The performance of work requiring invention, imagination, originality, all those things I cannot do in a recognized field of artistic or creative endeavor. The computer employee exemption, this is not your help desk workers. It's not your customer service representatives. They are not your folks running around and fixing equipment and pulling cables. You see the 4 bullet points I have up here. They tend to be high-level design, system application, testing, creation, modification regarding computer systems. This is often a misclassified position. Outside sales. The primary duty has to be making sales. Remember, that's a qualitative, not quantitative assessment. With regards to one type of outside sales, the folks that sit at like new home communities, there's an opinion letter that says 1 to 2 hours a day, 1 to 2 times a week is enough for your primary duty to be making sales. So long as you are customarily and regularly engaged away from the employer's pace of business. That is outside the business. Now, let me make a COVID point here. When COVID started and we brought all the salesmen home, right? No one wants to see you in their buildings and their offices. You can sit at your home computer and do sales there. You can Zoom. You can do Zoom and Teams or whatever. You don't need to do visits. There is no analog for webinar, electronic, telephone sales for the outside sales guy that stays home. If you are in your home office, you are at your place of business. You are no longer doing outside sales. And we have seen now, post-COVID, those now inside salespeople have not gone back out remote. Companies are saving money on travel. They've cut down on their sales workforce. They've realized they can be far more efficient just talking to people over the computer. You need to take a look at your outside sales exemptions and make sure that the guys that are really exempt are actually leaving the building multiple times a week and going out and visiting in person targets or customers. Let's talk now about overtime. Let's talk now about the calculation of overtime. Non-exempt employees are entitled to 1.5 times the employee's regular rate, not hourly rate, regular rate for hours worked over 40 in a work week. Now, a work week's right a 7-day period. There are states that have different rules. There's some states here that have no overtime laws at all. You know what I see here? There's 3 states that have some variation of an 8-hour overtime rule, daily overtime, and we have a few states that have some variation of a 12-hour overtime rule. So in addition to the federal law I just mentioned, you have some states that do their own thing. We have to keep that in mind. And by the way, keep in mind, these state rules change all the time. And we are keeping up with 50 states plus territories, and every week we see changes in various laws regarding a whole variety. If you do not have access to a service, and Littler has a service, and ComplianceHR has a service, to these changes, you need to do so because you are almost certainly missing things that are going to matter. There's states with other premium pay requirements in addition to 1.5 times. I note those examples here on this slide. But what is the regular rate? I said it's not the hourly rate. It's all remuneration for employment. Remuneration, fancy word for basically all the money you take in. Paid to an employee for a work week divided by all the hours. So you got your salary, you got your commission, you got your little bump for being safe that week. All that piled up, divided by all the hours worked, gives you a regular rate, typically higher than an hourly rate. And half of that is going to be due for hours worked over 40. Now, what compensation do we include in the overtime calculation, this regular rate number? What goes in that top category? All hourly wages, salary. Remember, you can have salary non-exempt workers. So salaries go up there, commissions, non-discretionary team awards, prizes and awards related to work. So you tell everybody, hey, look, We'll give everybody an extra $100 if we can meet this performance goal. That goes up there. Shift dips or job differentials, they go in that top number. On-call pay, gift cards, gift cards, the value of gift cards. RSUs, some of you guys know what I don't know what an RSU is. A restricted stock unit, put a question mark by it, because we are beginning to see that some stock awards that go to employees fall within this category, stock awards to non-exempt workers. If you have non-exempt workers that participate in some equity program, you should talk to your labor and employment counsel, your benefits counsel, about whether you're going to have to recalculate your overtime for those awards. Now, when we talk about compensation included in the OT, I want to talk about one unique issue. So I often get calls from companies that have bonuses. They pay annual bonuses. They say, but David, our plan language clearly says it's up to the sole discretion of the company. Because it's up to the sole discretion of the company, we're not going to go back and recalculate overtime. And I say, if the bonus program was announced to employees to drive their performance, so they know that every year you consider that there might be a year-end bonus, and the employees know if they work hard, they hit their numbers, and costs are low and revenue's high, that there will be a bonus paid, and there's typically a bonus paid. The Department of Labor and some courts will say it doesn't really matter that your plan says subject to the sole discretion of the company. And you will have to go back and recalculate overtime for every work week included in that period. And many companies just get bogged down right here, like everything grinds to a halt because there's no program that does this well. Pay systems don't do this well. It's complicated. Management has never really thought about it in terms of budgeting bonuses. One alternative is, instead of paying bonuses on a dollar amount, you pay bonuses based as a percentage of total comp. Say, look, if we hit our goal, we're going to pay everyone a percentage of their total comp. The year end, you say, okay, everyone's getting 3% of the total comp. Because it's paid on total comp and not straight comp and not base comp, it's already taking into account the overtime. So there's no other adjustments that have to be made. So that's the pro tip of the day for the 2,000 people on this call. Consider percentage of total comp bonuses. Talk to your in-house and outside counsel about it, but they are very effective for avoiding this recalculating overtime issue for bonuses. And what kind of compensation is excluded from overtime? By the way, we've had some grace from the Department of Labor on some of this. We know that employee benefits can be excluded. We know now, based on some changes of the rules, that wellness program costs can be excluded, gym access, employee discounts on services and products. You can exclude payments for time not worked. You can exclude business expense reimbursements, and it need not be solely for the employer benefit. So, for example, imagine a cell phone. You give an employee a cell phone. They use the cell phone for work. They also use it to play Gardenscapes or Roblox, not for work. The Department of Labor is okay with that. It doesn't have to be solely for the employer benefit. You can still exclude that for the overtime purposes. There are certain premium pays that can be excluded, certain weekend or holiday pay, or pay beyond normal work days. If you have premium pay situations and you haven't figured out how to exclude that from your overtime calculations, it's complicated to work through. You should do it with the involvement of counsel, but there are some potential credits there. And then like purely discretionary gifts, what I call like the attaboys. Like you pat somebody in the back, you say, hey, you know what? I know you didn't see this come up, but that was great. Here's a $100 gift card. to Amazon. Or the truly discretionary Christmas bonus. The unannounced, no one ever thought about it, bonus check that comes because you had a great year and no one even saw it coming. And then, of course, vacation, sick, or holiday hours. Those are examples of payment for time not worked. They're excluded from the overtime calculations. So I want to wrap up by talking about two, I think, really important, these last two slides, really important issues: armoring and auditing. Well, what in the world's armoring? Maybe you've heard us use that phrase before. It's really about armoring yourself from litigation or Department of Labor audits with regards to misclassification of exemption status. And so let me just start by just talking about job descriptions. Job descriptions are typically the last thing that people really focus on. We struggle to get one out of management. The ones we have are years out of date. No one really follows them. They're impossible to keep current. There's 10,000 things more important than having an accurate job description. An inaccurate job description can totally crater your misclassification lawsuit. It can also crater other things like your ADA cases, are those essential functions of the position or not, other things like that. But having an inaccurate job description can really hurt you. Sometimes I tell companies, if you don't want to have an accurate job description, don't use them at all. Stop using them. Like if you can't keep one up to date, get rid of it. But it can also support your exemption because you can use those job descriptions to go back and bolster the primary duties that we talked about in those 4 or 5 slides ago. All those important features and all the things that Navigator OT will pull out, you can say, look, here are the 5 most important things in your job. And by the way, they happen to track word for word what comes right out of the regulations. We expect you to make important, independent decisions about these 3 things. And so you think about when you're drafting your job description, how does that fit within the exemption you're applying? That means, by the way, managers can't just write job descriptions and send them to you. They become a collaborative effort with the HR and legal team. So that you're using your job descriptions, which, by the way, the employee sees and which the employee signs and attests to that that's their job. And it also has enough information so that we can tell what are the duties that are done most often. And if any of the users of Navigator OT are on the call, you'll know that there are sections of Navigator OT that ask you what percentage of the time is spent on these different duties. Your job description can help you do that. I often see job descriptions that are overpopulated with tons of non-exempt work. It's as if people went through and just thought, let's write down 100 things these people do. Even though the 80% of them, which are non-exempt, are done very little and not very often. We basically dumped all that information into a job description. The job description should identify the most important duties. The other thing I would note are self-assessments. The best thing to do with regards to armoring yourself in an exemption for exemption disputes, to have employees identify what they've done against these duties that have been built around the exemptions. So we talked about building job descriptions that take into account what the exemptions are. You have a self-assessment that does the same thing, and then you tell the employee, tell us, John, all the ways in which you engaged independent discretion and judgment with regards to these 3 things. And John says, well, this is my self-assessment, my self-evaluation. I am going to just fill this form up with all the amazing things I did this year. Sign. That becomes the single most important evidence we have with regards to arming yourself against these disputes. And you do it annually. It's part of the regular evaluation process are these self-assessments that have baked in considerations with regard to job descriptions. The other thing I want to talk about is auditing. And it is critical, and I would challenge you all in Q2 and Q3 to do this, to budget and plan for identifying whether your mathematics are right with regards to your regular rate, to identify whether the pay codes you're using that go into the regular rate or that do not go into the regular rate are correct. You'll find you may have hundreds of pay codes, many of which are being used, and you have no idea what they do or what they're for. Companies often, when they go through this process, strip down their pay codes. It's a real sort of closet cleaning affair. The other thing I want you to do, though, are consider your overtime exemptions. And Michael's going to get back to that here in just a second. There's a lot of criteria to consider, and I've listed those here. But remember, I told you to keep in mind the $75,000 or $80,000 or $85,000 annual number we may hear about from the Department of Labor. You should look at your roster now of exempt workers sorted by comp and highlight those, everybody from 85 to 35. Think about, okay, who in here should we go back and reassess, assuming that the new number is going to be below $85,000. It's going to be at $85,000 or slightly below that. You want to look for workers that have unique compensation arrangements. Remember, I talked about docking issues. I talked about the reasonable relationship test. You want to look for exempt workers who have few supervisors or large numbers of similar peer groups. You know, if you have 100 exempt administrative workers in the same position and no non-exempt, you likely have a problem. You want to look at exempt salespeople. Are they still outside or now are they inside? Look for exempt workers who have blue collar or manual duties. And then finally, has remote work changed the position profile since the last time you've done an audit? And in those circumstances, I would say these are the criteria you use for setting up an audit in the next quarter or two. I promise you, when the Department of Labor makes this change, you're going to be scrambling to figure out how to build your audit, start building it, and outlining it now. And with that, Michael, I'll flip it over to you.
David, thank you for that very comprehensive update. Obviously, it got the attention of a lot of folks. There's over 100 questions that we have in the Q&A box. So why don't you take a quick look in there and see if there's a few that you want to try to answer before we wrap up here. For folks who are interested in meeting with me and my team to get a brief demo of Navigator Overtime and get a free 1-week trial, if you are in full screen mode, you need to get out of that now. There's a polling question that will come up, and simply by saying yes to that, we will reach out to you and coordinate a meeting and get you all set up. You know, the important thing that I kept hearing today is, you know, how do I understand where all this is and the work you have to go through? That the real helpful thing about Navigator Overtime, it helps you quickly identify where your risk is. And that's where you bring in an expert like David to say, now what am I going to do? Should I push it to the left or right? And then work out those job descriptions and things that will make them get that way. So please, if you are interested, either ask for a demo in our Q&A or go to demo@compliancehr.com or just say yes. And David, would you like to try to answer a couple questions in our last couple of minutes?
Oh, I am still here. Sorry, I muted you.
Oh,
so I'm going to take
welcome back.
Right. I have 5 questions identified. Here's what I'm going to do. Here's the first one. When calculating overtime, does it matter what the work week looks like? Can it be Saturday to Friday or Wednesday to Tuesday, depending on what our needs are? You can have whatever 7-day period you want. It can begin at midnight. It can begin at 2:30 in the afternoon. It just has to repeat over and over and over. It could be different work weeks for different groups of people within your own workplace, but it has to remain static over the long term. All right, next question. Someone asked, can you program time clocks to prevent employees from clocking in before their scheduled start time? Let me say this about that particular issue. We need to be very careful about how we use time clocks. We want time clocks to be used to identify when employees actually work. What you should do is train your workforce to only clock in when they're going to begin work and clock out only when they end work, and not clock in before and not clock in after. And then discipline employees when they don't properly use the time clock. Somebody asked me, do we have information about where the Motor Carrier Act applies? And it's a great question. We have that information as part of Littler Edge. If you have that specific question, you're welcome to reach out to me. We have that question answered for all of the exemptions in all of the states. So if you have specific questions about what does the particular exemption have in our particular state and does it apply or not, I'm happy to answer that for you. Somebody else asked, somebody's asked regarding outside sales. Many sales employees stopped or significantly reduced their travel to customer sites, and that has continued post-COVID. Should companies be reevaluating whether they are now inside sales? I want to make one more point about this. I agree you should reevaluate it for sure. But this issue of significant reduction of their time to customer sites is going to be the problem. If your employees were normally outside of the office 5 days a week and now they're outside of the office once every 2 weeks, that's a problem. Wherever you see this significant reduction, we should be evaluating it. And make sure that you don't run afoul of the primary duty issue. So great question. If anybody has follow-up questions, I know there's a ton in here. There's a lot of fun talking to y'all. I couldn't get to all these questions. Hopefully we can sort out opportunities to answer more of these. You have my email address. You're welcome to reach out to me as well. Michael, I think that's all we got.
Well, first of all, David, thank you for such a thorough update. Really appreciate it. Always a pleasure working with you. And thank you for the over 2,000 people that attended today. I'm sure you found this content meaningful. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us, and we will help get you squared away with Navigator over time. Thank you, and signing off. Everyone have a wonderful day.